Hi, I'm Caroline Schmidt, and I translated Esther Kinsky's Grove. I'm honored and very excited to be nominated for the Oxford Weidenfeld Prize. Grove is my first book-length translation, and it's Esther Kinsky's third novel to be published in English. In addition to being a writer, Esther Kinsky is also an acclaimed literary translator. Her novel Grove was published in German under the title of Hein in 2018, and it won the Leipzig Book Prize that year. The translation Grove was published in 2020 by Fitzcarraldo Editions in the UK and by Transit Books based out of Oakland, California in the US. Grove is a novel in 3 parts. In the first section, an unnamed narrator who is recently bereaved travels alone to Olivano, a small village southeast of Rome. There, she tries to make sense of the world around her as she grieves the loss of her partner. In the second section, the narrator recounts childhood experiences of Italy, and in particular recollections of her father. The third section is once again in the present day, and the narrator travels to Italy once again, and this time to the north. What struck me most about the original German version of Grove was the language and the atmosphere that are evoked, and particularly how Esther Kinsky accomplished that on the level of sound. When I translate, I always read aloud, first the German and then later my English version. With Grove, I even, before sending in the manuscript, I read the German version aloud, followed by my translation. And I find that it gives me a better grasp on the arc of the sentences and the cadence of the voice and the way it reverberates in the body when it's read aloud. I find you become much more loose and natural and intuitive as opposed to when it's only in your mind. That's how it works for me anyway. It's different for everyone. And in Grove, some of the sentences are short, and at times it feels as if the narrator were pausing to catch her breath, and other sentences unfurl slowly. And by the time you get to the end, if you're reading out loud, I was almost lightheaded. And the pauses and the rhythm seem so important to me that I really let that guide my process. And at times I notice my translation slipping into iambic pentameter, which has the rhythm of footsteps and of walking, and that seemed appropriate for a field novel, as Esther refers to it. And on the whole, it was very much like translating poetry, because the use of alliteration and assonance and other phonic tools, even onomatopoeia, are so strong in Hein, the German version. And that posed a challenge for me as a translator, because I naturally felt very tied to the images that are evoked by the language and the picture she kind of paints for the reader to imagine. And at the same time, the language that evokes it is something on its own, and it adds a whole new level through sound. And German and English obviously sound very different. I'm used to translating living authors, but this was the first time that I had worked with someone who's practically a native speaker of English themselves, and that was very different. It was an interesting experience, because Esther Kinsky really already has an English voice, and making matters worse or different, however you look at it, I'm also from the United States, so we speak a very different English at times, I'm sure. But she was very gracious about wanting the translation to sort of have its own voice, to take on follow its own course. And after the book came out, I had the very rewarding experience of getting to hear her read from it absolutely beautifully for the online book launch. And that's an experience or opportunity that most translators probably usually don't get. So now I'm going to read a short chapter from Grove. It's from the second section of the book. And it was one of my absolute favorite parts to work on. But it was also a challenge to translate, beginning with its central metaphor between marbles and language, which is based on a wordplay that doesn't exist in English. The German word for marbles is murmeln, which also means to murmur or babble like a brook. In English, there's a closeness between the two words, at least. There are always some things that just get a bit lost in translation, but other things make up for it, hopefully. And in this chapter, the narrator describes being a child and listening to her father read Italian and not understanding the language, yet being content just to listen to it, and perhaps even a bit mesmerized as well. And that was something I could, of course, relate to. And Esther Kinsky describes language as an object which, in the narrator's childhood interpretation, of course, causes one to become blind if they examine it too closely. And of course, that's also a kind of professional hazard for a translator, because you spend your time on the sentence level and you don't think about structure, you don't think about the narrative arc, because that's already been done. But if you become too caught up in the micro, on the other hand, you can end up with a translation that feels very artificial. So I try to heed the narrator's cautionary tale. And now I'm going to read. Attipiano. Words rolled in my hand like marbles, damaged glass marbles with dull, scratched surfaces and tiny nicks, scoured by sand, dirt, concrete, the glass of other marbles. A soft click when they collided, a sound that my entire body would strain to hear to see if it would form a picture. Marbles were mysteries in my childhood. There were never rules for a game, nor players. They were simply something to have, in their beauty inexplicable. I once stuck a marble between my upper and lower eyelid and looked into the light. I didn't come any closer to the marble's mystery. It was merely black in front of my eye, yet I felt blinded. A short time later, I had an eye infection and secretly believed it stemmed from my experiment with the marble. I lay in my room with bandaged eyes. It was summer. I felt cold in the blackish, blind darkness and studied a small world with my hands, paths from one room to the next, along walls, railings, and doors. Each fingertip felt a different color. My father read to me, but in Italian, which I did not understand. You don't have to understand everything all the time, he said, and read on. Over time, the words became soothing. I found them beautiful and made my own sense of them. Sometimes I asked about a word, and my father would respond tersely in German. Hier, vielleicht, links, Berg. I'm not sure what book he read from, but it might have been a travel guide. Once I asked about a word that I had to repeat several times. Attipiano. Hochebene, said my father eventually. Plateau. And the word was just as strange to me as Albertina. But I didn't pursue it, because my father's explanations were endless and clarified very little, and I preferred listening to the Italian. The eye infection was cured before long, the blindfold removed, and I was able to see again. The world hadn't changed, but I had the word Attipiano in one hand and the word Hochebene in the other, and sometimes I held them furtively up to the light and tried to see through them, always taking care, however, not to bring them too close to my eye. Sometime afterwards, we watched a film in school about the River Po. Only much later did I come to know that the film is called La Gente del Po by Antonioni. At the time, it was just one of many black and white films about rivers. I also remember a film about the Rhone Delta and the Rhine near Rotterdam. The films flickered upon the canvas, damaged due to the many mended sections, tearing often, and the sound was accompanied by a constant crackling noise. When we watched the film about the Po, I immediately identified with the child who lay sick in bed below deck, even though it was the mother and not the father who read to her. Even though her eyes are not bandaged, she lies ill in the belly of the boat and sees nothing of the river or the landscape outside. I identified so strongly with this child that for a long time, when I reflected on my days of blindness, the smell of the school gym where we watched the film would rise into my nose, and the sound of the heavy, rubbery blackout curtains, drawn by older children, would shuffle in my ears. Many years later, when I had no longer been a child for some time, my father suffered from a broken blood vessel in his eye. He had to lie calmly and was not allowed to strain his eyes. I read to him. He wished for Italian stories, despite the fact that my Italian was poor. He corrected my pronunciation and interrupted me occasionally in order to elucidate things in a very long-winded manner. One of the books that I read was Narratori delle Pianura, and I remembered the old, beautiful secret word from long ago, Attipiano. When my father used another pronunciation mistake as an opportunity to interrupt, correct me, and provide a long-winded account of a carousel factory along the Po near Mantua, apparently world-renowned, I imagined a stretch of river landscape in northern Italy, blanketed in undulating fog, hovering between heaven and earth directly beneath a low-hanging cloud cover. Sparse poplar groves anchored the landscape into the skies. That was from Grove by Esther Kinsky. Thanks for listening.